Hi, I'm Margaret. We are going to be talking about your control repo. The control repo for Puppet is your source of truth. It contains key information like environment structure, Hiera data modules, configurations that is used to deploy code across your infrastructure. It's powerful in driving collaboration and standardization across environments. It simplifies code deployment and keeps all code version controlled. Tony's going to walk you through an example. Tony?
Hi everyone, my name's Tony Green. Now, if you're fairly new to Puppet, you will have heard the term control repo. A control repo or control repository is a core part of Puppet. The idea behind it is it becomes a central location that you can manage your configuration for your entire fleet, but it's broken up into components that allow you to do delegation of authority, testing in different ways. And whilst there's a lot of documentation out there as to how to download and start with a control repo, sometimes people can get a little bit confused about what goes where. At the end of the day, the control repo is actually just a Puppet module. A Puppet module that's structured in a specific way, but a module nonetheless. So what we're going to talk about is how to get started with that. I'm going to walk you through what the various locations within a control repo are. It's certainly not going to be an exhaustive coverage of everything. We're going to have lots of other videos that will dive deeper into roles and profiles, Hiera, securing Hiera, different locations for different things. But this will give you a good overview of what the control repo is used for. So we actually have a templated control repo up on our GitHub page, which we will link. I'm actually going to take this control repo and clone it, and then I'm going to get a full screen console so we can see what's happening. I'm going to clone the repository. So it creates a directory called control repo, imaginatively enough. Inside the control repo, it's a bunch of files. Now, some of them, code owners, license, README, stuff like that, are fairly generic. The README is actually quite good, contains a lot of detail, but we're not going to dive into that. The files we're going to look at initially are the Puppet file, the Environment.conf, and the YAML file, the Hiera.yaml. So Environment.conf is a very important file. It's really what sets the control repo aside from a lot of other module types. If we have a look at it, what it tells us is what should be considered a module path. In this instance, Puppet has a concept of base module path. We're adding to it site modules and modules. So whenever Puppet is looking for a module, the first place it's going to look is inside site modules. The second place is inside modules. And the third place is base module path. Those will be things that come bundled by default with your Puppet environment. We also then have a config version. This is a script, which I'll show you later, but basically it just gives you a way of identifying the config version that you're running. So when it appears in reports, you know what version of your code you're applying. The Hiera file, and again, if you're not sure what Hiera is, there's another video in this series that will cover Hiera. It is our configuration management database, effectively key value pair in sort of reverse hierarchical order. So it starts with the most specific and then ends with the least specific values. So in this, we're just setting up Hiera version 5. The Hiera values will live inside the data directory in YAML backend, and we've specified you should look for entries inside the nodes directory inside data and match on your certificate name.yaml, and you should look in common.yaml. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time diving into Hiera. This is more to give you an overview of what each area does. The last file here, just before I dive into the Puppet file, you'll notice that when we looked at the Environment.conf, it specified the module path would be site modules, which we can see, and modules. Now, I don't see a modules directory there. There won't be, and you shouldn't create one. What happens is anything that's stored within your Puppet file is considered to be a module or an external piece of data that we're bringing back, usually by Git. For the most part, the default values, default configuration will allow you to download stuff from the Forge, and those things, when they're downloaded, will go into a modules directory, which will be automatically created during the code deployment process. If that doesn't make sense, I'll try and explain it in a bit more detail. So if we look at the Puppet file here, it's specifying we're using the standard Forge, and if we were to uncomment these files, when we commit this and deploy it, it would, during the deployment process, create a directory on your Puppet server called modules, and these modules would be deployed inside that module. If you're familiar with Git, it's a little bit like Git submodules kind of approach. What it means is we're able to specify dependencies without having to actually include all of those modules within our control repo, because nesting Git modules within Git modules gets very messy. So the Puppet file is a very easy way for you to control additional functionality, additional modules, libraries that you want included in Puppet. Again, we'll do a deep dive into the Puppet file at some point in the future. Now we've looked at those three base files, we'll have a quick look in data, which is where our Hiera data will live. And if you remember, we saw there was a nodes directory. And inside that nodes directory, we see an entry for example node.yaml, which doesn't have any value. And we have a common.yaml. And again, all it's saying is this node is using common data. So again, this is a structure. In a production environment or a more mature environment, you will see a lot more detail in here. The next file we're going to look at is within the manifests area. Now, if you're familiar with Puppet code, you're aware that most Puppet code lives within manifests, and that's where you'll see sort of Puppet code in general. Inside your control repo manifest directory, it usually just contains one file called Site.pp. There are other ways of doing things. If it contains anything other than Site.pp and you don't know why, have a chat with your Puppet practitioners before you start changing anything. Site.pp is the place that we put our classification if we're doing classification in code. Again, classification's a little bit out of scope here, but I'll show you what Site.pp looks like. Ignoring the comments, we turn off file backups. There's details there about how and why. And then we have node matches. So in this case, we're not actually doing anything. We're not matching anything. We're not doing any classification. But when you look at a real Puppet control repo, which I'll show you one towards the end, you'll see that this is where your classification work will be done. Hopefully, you'll be using things like trusted facts to declare roles and profiles. Again, something we'll cover in another session. Where you get into the real meat of a control repo is underneath an area called site modules. Now, site modules was created out of effectively patterns that the community and Puppet agreed on a long time ago. There were a lot of different ways of classifying Puppet environments, and some of them became more complex and difficult to manage. So the idea was to come up with roles and profiles. Again, roles and profiles are simply parts of a module. So if I go into the role directory here, this is effectively, we see a manifest directory, this is a module. And we see here, we've got some servers definitions. So within here, we have our roles that we can assign to servers. So if I look at the web server, it's class role web server, which includes profile base. Now, it's important to note the structure there. So this says its class is role web server, include profile base. The directory I'm in at the moment is site module role, which matches that delineation, web server. So in the standard Puppet naming convention, it would look for the module here, which is the module role, and then try and find a file within there that match the definition of web server. And if we jump back to the profile area and look at manifests, again, if we look at base, profile base. So Again, if you're not familiar with the structure of a Puppet module, we'll have some other sessions on how to actually write and understand modules. The control repo itself usually doesn't contain an awful lot of actual Puppet code, detailed Puppet code that manages files and directories or services and things like that. We often pull in other code from other areas, other modules or things that you've written, whether they be external, things that your teams have written, or whether you're pulling them in from the Forge. In order to give you an idea of what a functioning control repo looks like, although some people would say my control repo isn't necessarily fully functional, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just running through how things look in a more complete environment. Again, if any of the stuff here has confused you or anything else, I would advise you sort of look into more of the detail around the specific areas. This was more around what the structure of a control repo would be. So my control repo, you'll notice almost exactly the same set of files. I have an Environment.conf, data, Hiera, things like that. If I look at my Hiera YAML file, you'll see it's got an awful lot more detail in there. Again, I'm not going to dive into Hiera in too much detail here, but you can still see we've got nodes, trusted cert name, we've got common. So the structure is very similar. My Puppet file contains a lot more modules. So when I do a deployment of this code, all of these modules are pulled in from the Forge. So it makes sense that a lot of these would be held externally, because we don't want to store that amount of detail within our control repo. My manifests, Site.pp, only really has these lines extra from what we saw. And this does all of my classification. Now, there are different ways you can do classification. You can do it through the console. You can do it through Site.pp. There's lots of other ways. This really is considered best practice. So we use the trusted role. And if you're not sure what a trusted fact is, again, another video we've done on that. And it includes those roles. And lastly, looking at the site modules, if I go into roles manifest, I can see a lot more detail in here as to the types of role we have, and even nested roles. So I can look at my PE server here, and I can see its class role PE master, require profile base, and include PE master profile. So the structure is identical. It's a bit more content, a little bit more complexity. Hopefully this has given you a broader understanding of what a control repo does. There's a lot of documentation around this, including in the README file here, around how to deploy those and integrate them into your Git environment, using tools like CD4P for testing this and then managing the deployment of it. In a future session, we're going to talk about Puppet environments, so how we have different versions of our Puppet code, how we promote them through, using, again, CD4P or other tools to be able to do that testing. And we'll have sessions on, deeper dive sessions on Hiera and roles and profiles and how to manage your Puppet file. So hopefully this has been useful. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, feel free to let us know if there's any other stuff you want us to cover. Thank you.